The October wind carried the scent of dying grass and distant smoke across the Mackenzie ranch as Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The Texas prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by scattered mesquite trees and the weathered fence posts that marked the boundaries of land she could barely manage alone. 3 months had passed since cholera claimed her husband Thomas, and each day felt like a battle against the relentless isolation that threatened to swallow her whole. Sarah stepped off the porch of their modest wooden house, her worn boots crunching on the frost-touched ground. At 28, she possessed a quiet strength that belied her petite frame, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that held both determination and sorrow. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and Cedar Creek, if the dusty collection of buildings could be called a town, was a hard day's ride through dangerous territory. She made her way toward the barn to tend to the animals, her daily routine unchanged despite the weight of loneliness that pressed upon her shoulders. The milk cow needed attention, and the 3 remaining horses required feed and water. Thomas had left her with enough supplies to last through winter, but come spring she'd face impossible choices about the future of their dream. As Sarah approached the barn, something caught her eye. A dark shape lying motionless near the property's eastern boundary, perhaps 200 yards from the main buildings. She stopped, squinting against the morning glare, her heart beginning to race. In this part of Texas, anything unusual could mean danger. Indian raids, while less common than in previous years, still posed a real threat. Bandits and cattle rustlers roamed the territory with increasing boldness. Moving back toward the house, Sarah retrieved Thomas's Winchester rifle from above the fireplace mantel. The weapon felt heavy and foreign in her hands. She'd practiced with it only a few times since his death, but knew her survival might depend on her willingness to use it. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked cautiously toward the mysterious figure. As she drew closer, details became clearer. It was a man, lying face down in the tall grass, motionless, dark hair, bronze skin, wearing buckskin clothing and moccasins. A Comanche warrior by all appearances. Sarah's first instinct was to retreat, to barricade herself in the house and wait. But something held her in place, perhaps the stillness of the figure, or the dark stain of blood visible on the grass around him. Against every practical thought screaming in her mind, Sarah approached until she stood just a few feet away. The man was young, probably near her own age, with a powerfully built frame that spoke of a life lived outdoors. A deep gash ran along his left shoulder, and another wound marked his side. Both appeared to be from bullets rather than arrows or blades. His breathing was shallow but steady. "Dear Lord," Sarah whispered, lowering the rifle slightly. Here was a human being, wounded and helpless, lying on her land. Everything she'd been taught about Indians, every story of violence and conflict, warred with the basic Christian compassion Thomas had always encouraged her to practice. The practical voice in her head catalogued the dangers. Helping him could bring his tribe down upon her. If the townspeople discovered her actions, she'd be branded a traitor, or worse. This man might kill her the moment he regained consciousness. But looking at his still form, seeing the blood that had seeped into the earth, Sarah saw only a person in desperate need. Making a decision that would change everything, she set the rifle aside and knelt beside the wounded warrior. His skin was hot with fever, and she could see that infection had begun to set in around the bullet wounds. Without immediate care, he would certainly die. "I must be losing my mind," Sarah murmured to herself, but she was already planning how to move him. The barn would provide shelter and concealment, while she decided what to do next. Using every ounce of her strength and leverage techniques Thomas had taught her for handling stubborn livestock, she managed to half-drag, half-carry the unconscious man across the prairie grass. By the time she'd gotten him settled on a bed of clean hay in the barn's back stall, Sarah was exhausted and completely committed to a course of action that terrified her. As she looked down at the wounded Comanche warrior, his face peaceful in unconsciousness, she realized she'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered supplies from the house, clean cloth for bandages, the bottle of whiskey Thomas had saved for special occasions, needle and thread, and the few medical remedies she'd learned from her mother. The autumn afternoon sun slanted through the barn's wooden slats, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor where the wounded warrior lay unconscious. She'd managed to remove his blood-soaked buckskin shirt, revealing the extent of his injuries. The shoulder wound appeared to be a through-and-through bullet hole, painful but clean. The injury to his side was more concerning, The bullet remained lodged beneath the skin, and the surrounding flesh showed signs of infection. Sarah had helped Thomas tend injured cattle and horses, but treating human wounds felt infinitely more daunting. "Stay unconscious a while longer," she whispered, threading the needle with steady hands despite her nerves. "This is going to hurt us both." Working by lamplight as the day faded, Sarah cleaned the wounds with whiskey, causing the man to stir and mutter words in a language she didn't understand. His fevered movements revealed intricate tattoos across his chest and arms, symbols and patterns that told stories she could only imagine. Despite her fear, Sarah found herself studying his face, noting the strong jawline and prominent cheekbones that spoke of nobility and strength. The bullet extraction proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. With makeshift forceps fashioned from kitchen utensils, Sarah worked carefully to remove the lead slug, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool evening air. When the bullet finally came free with a soft pop, the warrior's eyes snapped open. Sarah found herself staring into dark brown eyes that held no fear, only sharp intelligence and wariness. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the man attempted to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his injured side. Sarah instinctively placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Easy," she said softly. "You're hurt badly. I'm trying to help." Though he clearly didn't understand her words, something in her tone seemed to calm him. The warrior studied her face, taking in her concerned expression and the blood on her hands. His blood. His gaze moved to the medical supplies scattered around them, then back to her eyes. A look of confusion crossed his features, as if he couldn't reconcile her actions with everything he might have expected from a white woman. Sarah pointed to herself. "Sarah," she said clearly, then gestured toward him with raised eyebrows. After a long moment, he responded in a voice roughened by fever and pain. "Ayana." The name rolled off his tongue like music, and Sarah found herself repeating it softly. "Ayana." She nodded, then pointed to his wounds and made sewing motions. "I need to stitch these closed." Understanding seemed to pass between them despite the language barrier. Ayana nodded once and lay back down, his jaw set in preparation for pain. Sarah worked as quickly and carefully as she could, stitching both wounds closed while he remained silent and still, though she could see the tension in every line of his body. When she finished, Sarah sat back on her heels, exhausted. She'd done what she could, but infection remained a serious threat. Ayana would need constant care over the next several days if he was to survive. The magnitude of what she'd undertaken began to settle over her like a heavy blanket. As if reading her thoughts, Ayana spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. Though she couldn't understand the language, his tone conveyed something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps a question about her motivations. "I don't know why I'm doing this either," Sarah admitted, beginning to clean up her makeshift medical supplies. "But I couldn't just let you die." The sound of approaching hoofbeats froze them both. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady pace toward her property. Through the barn's small window, she could see lantern light bobbing in the darkness, riders coming up the main trail to her house. Ayana had heard them too. Despite his weakened condition, he tried to rise, probably intending to flee and spare her the consequences of helping him. Sarah placed a firm hand on his arm, shaking her head vigorously. "No," she whispered. "Stay down. Stay quiet." Moving quickly, she threw a horse blanket over Ayana and scattered loose hay to disguise the shape of his body. Then, grabbing her rifle and trying to calm her racing heart, Sarah walked out of the barn to meet whoever was approaching her isolated ranch in the darkness. The riders pulled up in front of her house just as she emerged. 3 men from Cedar Creek, including Deputy Marshal Jake Morrison and 2 local ranchers she recognized. Their lanterns cast dancing shadows across the yard, and their expressions were grim. "Evening, Mrs. Mackenzie," Deputy Morrison called out, touching the brim of his hat. "Sorry to disturb you so late, but we're tracking a wounded Comanche warrior. Trail goes cold somewhere near your property line. You seen or heard anything unusual today?" Sarah's mouth felt suddenly dry, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "No, Deputy. Been quiet here all day. What happened?" "Raiding party hit the Hendersons' place yesterday morning," one of the ranchers spoke up. "Ran off with some horses and cattle. We caught up with most of them, but one got away wounded. Dangerous to leave him out there, especially with winter coming on. Desperate man might try anything. We'll be searching the area come morning," Morrison added. Wanted to warn you to keep your doors locked and your rifle closed. If you see anything, tracks, disturbance, anything at all, you send word to town immediately." Sarah nodded, gripping the Winchester tighter. "Of course, Deputy. I appreciate the warning." As the men prepared to ride on, Morrison paused. "You doing all right out here by yourself, Mrs. Mackenzie? It's not safe for a woman alone, especially with hostiles in the area." "I'm managing fine," Sarah replied, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. After the riders disappeared into the darkness, Sarah stood in the yard for several minutes, listening to the prairie wind and trying to process what she'd learned. The man in her barn, Ayanna, was apparently part of a raiding party. The practical voice in her head screamed that she should have turned him over to the law, that she was harboring a dangerous criminal. But when she returned to the barn and saw him lying still beneath the horse blanket, fever still burning in his dark eyes, all she could think about was the trust he'd shown in allowing her to treat his wounds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangers, but tonight she had made her choice. Sarah settled into the hay beside her patient, rifle within reach, and began the long vigil that would test everything she thought she knew about right and wrong, enemy and friend, in the unforgiving landscape of the Texas frontier. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Mackenzie ranch, bringing with it the distant sound of search parties combing the prairie. Sarah had dozed fitfully through the night, starting awake at every creak of the barn or whisper of wind through the eaves. Ayanna's fever had broken sometime before sunrise, leaving him weak but more alert than he'd been since she'd found him. She brought him water and thin broth made from chicken bones, watching as he struggled to sit up enough to drink. The simple act of swallowing seemed to exhaust him, but his eyes remained watchful, tracking her movements with keen intelligence. When she checked his bandages, she was relieved to see no fresh bleeding and only minimal signs of infection. "You're healing," Sarah said softly, more to herself than to him. "Stronger than you look." Ayanna spoke then, a string of words in his native tongue that carried the cadence of a question. When Sarah shook her head apologetically, he tried again, this time pointing to the barn walls and making gestures that seemed to ask about the sounds outside, the calling voices and hoofbeats that had been growing steadily closer since daybreak. Understanding passed between them. Sarah pointed toward the barn door, then made a sweeping motion with her hands. "Men looking for you." She pointed at him, then shook her head firmly. "But they won't find you here." The complexity of their situation weighed heavily on both of them. Ayanna was clearly a man accustomed to action, to controlling his own fate. Being helpless and dependent on the mercy of a white woman, one of the people his tribe considered enemies, must have been almost unbearable. Yet he showed no hostility toward Sarah, only a cautious gratitude that seemed to puzzle him as much as it did her. Around mid-morning, the inevitable happened. Heavy footsteps approached the barn, and Deputy Morrison's voice called out, "Mrs. Mackenzie, you in there?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly threw the horse blanket over Ayanna and arranged hay to conceal his form. "Coming, Deputy," she called back, grabbing a milk pail to explain her presence in the barn. Morrison stood in the doorway, his weathered face serious beneath his hat brim. Behind him, 2 other men waited on horseback, their rifles ready. "Sorry to bother you again, ma'am, but we found blood traces leading this direction. Mind if we take a look around?" "Of course not," Sarah replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Though I can't imagine how anyone could hide in here. The animals would raise a fuss." As if to prove her point, the milk cow lowed softly from her stall, and one of the horses nickered. Morrison walked slowly through the barn, his boots crunching on the straw-covered floor. Sarah held her breath as he passed within 3 feet of Ayanna's hiding place, but the deputy's attention was focused on the shadows near the back wall and the ladder leading to the hayloft. "Trail goes cold about 100 yards from here," Morrison mused, studying the barn's interior. "Ground's too hard to hold tracks well. He could have gone in any direction." "Maybe the blood you found was from an injured animal," Sarah suggested. "Coyotes have been troubling the livestock lately." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Could be. We'll keep searching, but that Comanche's probably long gone by now. They're like ghosts when they want to disappear." He touched his hat brim. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Mackenzie. Remember what I said about staying alert." After the search party moved on, Sarah waited a full hour before uncovering Ayanna. When she pulled away the blanket, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He said something in his language, the tone conveying what might have been amazement or respect. "You could have died because of me," Sarah said, knowing he couldn't understand the words but hoping he might grasp their meaning. I don't know why I'm risking everything to help you. Ayana struggled to prop himself up on one elbow, then pointed to himself and spoke a single word. Why? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah sat down in the hay beside him, considering her answer. How could she explain to this wounded warrior that she'd seen too much death, too much hatred, that Thomas had always taught her to judge people by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the culture they came from? Instead of trying to explain with words he wouldn't understand, Sarah showed him. She brought clean water and carefully changed his bandages, her touch gentle and professional. She fed him more broth and honey water, patiently helping him when his strength flagged. When he shivered in the cool air, she brought additional blankets from the house. Over the next 3 days, a strange friendship began to develop between them. Ayana taught Sarah words in Comanche, Pia for water, Tukamaru for good, Maru for food. Sarah reciprocated with English words, pointing to objects and speaking clearly. Horse, hay, medicine. They developed a system of gestures and simple drawings in the dirt floor that allowed for basic communication. She learned that Ayana was not just a warrior but something more, perhaps a leader or medicine man among his people. The way he studied her movements, her expressions, suggested a mind trained in reading people and situations. When she brought him paper and a pencil from the house, he drew with surprising skill, creating images that told stories of buffalo hunts, tribal ceremonies, and the vast landscape of his homeland. But it was on the 4th evening that Sarah truly began to understand the man she was harboring. Ayana had grown strong enough to sit up for extended periods, and she found him carving something from a piece of wood she'd brought for the fire. Using only a small knife from his belongings, he was creating an intricate figure of a horse, its mane flowing as if caught in wind. When he noticed her watching, Ayana held up the carving and spoke slowly. For you. The English words were heavily accented but clear. Sarah accepted the gift with wonder, running her fingers over the smooth wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail rendered with loving care. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. Understanding flickered in his eyes at her tone, and he smiled for the first time since she'd found him. The expression transformed his face, revealing warmth and humor that had been hidden beneath layers of pain and wariness. That night, as autumn rain drummed against the barn roof, Sarah realized that everything had changed. This was no longer about nursing a wounded stranger back to health. Somehow, despite every barrier of language and culture, she and Ayana had begun to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of hostile peoples. But the outside world hadn't forgotten about the wounded Comanche warrior, and the fragile peace of their hidden sanctuary was about to be shattered. The 5th morning brought visitors Sarah had been dreading. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell and her daughter Beth from Cedar Creek, arriving in their buckboard with a load of supplies and enough curiosity to fill a barn. Eleanor Hartwell was the town's unofficial social coordinator and primary source of gossip, a woman who could detect secrets the way a bloodhound followed scent trails. Sarah had barely enough time to ensure Ayana was well hidden before the women knocked on her front door, their voices bright with forced cheerfulness that masked deeper concerns. Sarah, dear, we simply had to check on you, Mrs. Hartwell announced, bustling into the small kitchen with her arms full of covered dishes. With all this Indian trouble, it's not safe for you to be alone out here. We've brought food and company. Beth Hartwell, barely 18 and full of romantic notions about frontier life, gazed around the modest house with wide eyes. Mama says you might come stay in town until the danger passes. There's talk of more raids. Sarah accepted their offerings graciously while her mind raced. The women would expect a tour of the property, questions about her livestock, lengthy conversations about everything happening in Cedar Creek. Every minute they remained increased the risk of discovery. That's very kind of you both, Sarah replied, leading them to the sitting area. But I can't abandon the ranch. Thomas worked too hard building this place. Mrs. Hartwell's sharp eyes took in every detail of the room, the rifle prominently displayed, the extra blankets Sarah had forgotten to put away, the muddy boots by the door. Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Deputy Morrison says they found blood trails near your property. I told him it was probably from an injured animal, Sarah said carefully. Coyotes have been troubling the livestock. Mrs. Hartwell didn't look convinced. Well, we should check on your animals while we're here. Make sure everything's secure. Sarah's heart sank but she couldn't refuse without arousing more suspicion. "Of course, though I should warn you, the milk cow's been temperamental lately." As they walked toward the barn, Sarah prayed that Ayanna would remain absolutely still. She'd positioned him in the far stall, behind feed sacks and under heavy blankets, but Mrs. Hartwell had an uncanny ability to notice things others missed. The inspection began routinely enough. Mrs. Hartwell examined the horses with a knowledgeable eye, commenting on their condition and asking pointed questions about Sarah's ability to manage them alone. Beth admired the milk cow and gathered eggs from the chicken coop, chattering about her own attempts at farm work. But as they prepared to leave the barn, disaster struck in the most unexpected way. Mrs. Hartwell spotted the wooden horse carving lying partially hidden in the hay where Sarah had left it the previous evening. She picked it up with obvious curiosity, turning it over in her hands. "My goodness, Sarah, where did you get this? The workmanship is extraordinary." Sarah's mouth went dry. The carving was unmistakably Native American in style, far too sophisticated to have been made by anyone in Cedar Creek. Thomas had it, from before we married." "Really?" Mrs. Hartwell's tone grew sharper. "It looks fresh-made to me. See how the wood hasn't darkened with age?" She held the carving up to the light streaming through the barn door. "This is Comanche work, or I'm much mistaken. My late husband collected such pieces." Beth moved closer to examine the horse, her young face bright with interest. "It's beautiful, Mama. Look how realistic it is." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes narrowed as she studied Sarah's face. "You're quite certain Thomas had this? Because Deputy Morrison specifically mentioned that the wounded Comanche they're tracking is known for his wood carving. It's how they identified him. Several raids have been followed by the discovery of small carved animals left behind." The barn seemed to shrink around Sarah as she felt the walls closing in. Her palms grew sweaty, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Behind the feed sacks, she prayed that Ayanna was understanding the danger and remaining perfectly still. "I'm sure I would remember if Thomas had shown me such a thing," Sarah said weakly, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Mrs." Hartwell stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than a shout. "Sarah Mackenzie, are you harboring that wounded savage? Because if you are, you're not just risking your own life, you're endangering every settler in this territory." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. Sarah could see suspicion crystallizing in Mrs. Hartwell's eyes, could watch as the older woman's mind began connecting scattered pieces into a damning picture. Beth looked confused by the sudden tension, glancing between the two women with growing unease. Before Sarah could formulate a response, a new sound cut through the morning air, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, many horses moving fast. Through the barn's small window, they could see a large group of riders cresting the hill that led to the Mackenzie Ranch. But these weren't more searchers from Cedar Creek. Even at a distance, the riders were clearly Native American, their horses decorated with feathers and paint, their formations speaking of purpose and urgency. "Dear God," Mrs. Hartwell breathed, dropping the wooden horse carving as her face drained of color. Comanche, a whole war party. Beth let out a small scream and pressed herself against her mother's side. Both women looked to Sarah with desperate hope, expecting her to lead them to safety, to barricade the house, to do something to protect them from the approaching riders. But Sarah found herself frozen, not with fear, but with the terrible realization that the moment of truth had finally arrived. In the hidden stall behind her, Ayanna would know that his people were coming. The choice she'd been avoiding for days now lay before her, with crystal clarity. She could maintain her deception, claim ignorance, and hope that the approaching Comanche would pass by without incident. She could confess to Mrs. Hartwell and Beth, throw herself on their mercy, and pray they would understand her motivations. Or she could step forward into whatever consequences awaited, trusting that the bond she'd built with Ayanna over the past 5 days meant something more than the fear and prejudice that had shaped her world. As the riders drew closer, their war cries echoing across the prairie, Sarah Mackenzie made the decision that would define the rest of her life. The Comanche war party approached with the fluid grace of natural horsemen, their painted ponies moving as extensions of their riders' will. Sarah counted at least 20 warriors, their faces marked with ceremonial paint, feathers dancing in their hair as they rode. At their head was an older man whose bearing spoke of authority and wisdom, clearly a chief or war leader of significant standing. Mrs. Hartwell grabbed Sarah's arm with trembling fingers. "The house," she whispered urgently. "We need to get to the house and barricade ourselves in." But Sarah stood rooted in place, her eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of hay and knew that Ayana was stirring, probably recognizing the voices calling out in his native tongue. The wooden horse carving lay forgotten at her feet, a small symbol of the impossible bridge she'd tried to build between two worlds. "Sarah," Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose to near panic. "What are you doing? Move." Instead, Sarah walked slowly out of the barn into the open yard, her hands visible and empty. The lead rider, a man perhaps 50 years old with silver threading through his long black hair, raised his hand, and the war party came to a halt 30 yards from where she stood. His dark eyes studied her with keen intelligence, taking in her simple dress, her unbound auburn hair, the absence of weapons. When he spoke, his English was clear and carefully pronounced. "White woman, we seek our brother, Ayana, son of Chief Running Bear. He was wounded. His trail leads to this place." Sarah felt Mrs. Hartwell and Beth emerge from the barn behind her, their fear a palpable presence at her back. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and blood would soak into the prairie grass. "I am Sarah Mackenzie," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "This is my land." The war leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "You have seen our brother." Everything Sarah had been taught about Indians, every story of violence and betrayal, every warning about the savage nature of the Comanche people, screamed at her to lie, to deny, to send these warriors away from her door. But as she looked into the lead rider's face, she saw not a bloodthirsty savage, but a man consumed with worry for someone he loved. "Yes," Sarah said simply, "I have seen him." Mrs. Hartwell made a small, choked sound behind her. Several of the warriors shifted on their horses, hands moving closer to weapons, but their leader held up a restraining hand. "Where is Ayana?" the war chief asked. Sarah turned toward the barn and called out in the mixture of English and Comanche words she'd learned, "Ayana, Tukamaru, come." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Then slowly, the barn door creaked open wider, and Ayana emerged. He was still pale from blood loss and clearly weak, but he walked upright with dignity intact. His chest was bare except for the clean white bandages Sarah had applied that morning, and his dark hair hung loose around his shoulders. The reaction from the war party was immediate and profound. Several warriors slid from their horses and approached Ayana with obvious relief and joy, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. But Ayana's eyes remained fixed on Sarah, and when he spoke, his words were directed as much to her as to his people. The war leader dismounted and walked slowly towards Sarah, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Hartwell's labored breathing and Beth's muffled sobs. "You are the one who healed our brother," the chief said. It wasn't a question. "I did what I could," Sarah replied. "He was badly hurt. Ayana tells us you hid him from the white soldiers, that you risked your life to tend his wounds." The chief's eyes studied her face intently. "Why?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah thought of all the reasons she could give: Christian duty, simple human decency, the loneliness that had driven her to value any human companionship. But in the end, she spoke from the heart. "Because I saw a person who needed help," she said. Nothing else mattered. Ayana stepped forward then, speaking to the war chief in rapid Comanche. His words carried the weight of advocacy, of explanation, of something that might have been a request or a plea. The older man listened intently, occasionally glancing at Sarah with an expression that grew more thoughtful by the moment. Finally, Ayana turned to Sarah and spoke in careful English. "I tell Grey Eagle of your kindness, of how you saved my life when you could have let me die." He paused, searching for the right words. "My people, they wish to honor you." Grey Eagle stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his war shirt, the weathered lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent scanning distant horizons. When he placed a hand on her shoulder, Mrs. Hartwell gasped audibly. "Sarah Mackenzie," Grey Eagle said formally, "you have shown great courage. You have given life to one of our own when hatred would have been easier. For this, the Comanche people name you Tutsu, sister." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. The warriors formed a circle around her, and Grey Eagle spoke in his native tongue, his words carrying the cadence of ritual and ceremony. Ayana translated softly, "He tells the story of your kindness. He says you are now under the protection of our people. He says your enemies are our enemies, your troubles are our troubles." One of the younger warriors brought forward a beautifully crafted necklace, made of silver, turquoise, and eagle feathers. Grey Eagle placed it around Sarah's neck with solemn ceremony. "This belonged to my sister," he said quietly. "She was killed by white soldiers 3 winters ago. Now you will wear it and her spirit will watch over you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as the weight of the necklace settled around her shoulders. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Hartwell whispering prayers under her breath, but Sarah felt no fear, only a profound sense of recognition. These people, who had been portrayed to her as savage enemies, were honoring her with a ceremony of adoption and protection. Ayana approached her one final time, pressing something into her hands. It was another carving, this one of a woman on horseback, her hair flowing behind her as she rode across an endless prairie. "For the woman who showed me that courage has many faces," he said in English, then added something in Comanche that made several warriors nod approvingly. As quickly as they had arrived, the Comanche prepared to depart. Ayana mounted behind one of the other warriors, his strength still too diminished for him to ride alone. Before they left, Grey Eagle spoke once more to Sarah. "If ever you have need, send word to the Comanche people. We do not forget those who show kindness to our family." The war party rode away as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats to mark their passage. Sarah stood in her yard, the ceremonial necklace heavy around her neck, the wooden carving warm in her hands, trying to process everything that had just occurred. Mrs. Hartwell was the first to break the silence, her voice shaking with a mixture of awe and accusation. "Sarah Mackenzie, do you realize what you've done? You've made yourself an ally of the Comanche. The townspeople will never understand. They'll call you a traitor, an Indian lover." Sarah turned to face the older woman, and Mrs. Hartwell stepped back at what she saw in her eyes. Gone was the uncertain widow who had struggled to manage alone on her isolated ranch. In her place stood a woman who had found her strength in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Let them call me what they will," Sarah said quietly. "I know what I am. I'm a woman who chose compassion over fear, understanding over hatred, and I'm proud of that choice." Beth Hartwell, who had remained silent throughout the entire encounter, stepped forward with wonder in her young eyes. "Mrs. Mackenzie, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. They really called you sister." "Yes," Sarah said, touching the necklace at her throat. "They did." As the dust settled over the Mackenzie ranch, Sarah knew that her life had been forever changed. The lonely widow who had found a wounded stranger on her land no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who had discovered that courage came not from the absence of fear, but from acting with love despite that fear. She had hidden a wounded Comanche in her barn and emerged as a sister to 2 worlds, a bridge between peoples who had been taught to see each other only as enemies. And though the future remained uncertain, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine, Sarah Mackenzie faced it with the knowledge that she had chosen correctly when it mattered most. The wooden horse carving still lay in the dust where Mrs. Hartwell had dropped it. Sarah picked it up and carried it into her house, placing it carefully on the mantelpiece beside her husband's photograph. 2 symbols of love, separated by culture and circumstance, but united in their testament to the power of human connection. Outside, the Texas prairie stretched endlessly under the autumn sky, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a Comanche warrior carried with him the memory of a white woman's kindness, a story that would be told around tribal fires for generations to come, ensuring that Sarah Mackenzie's courage would never be forgotten.